Good morning. I'm Matt Jaffe. I'm the Interim Executive Director here at the IOP, and today we are honored to welcome former National Security Advisor to President Obama, Susan Rice. Before we get started, I wanted to give a quick plug for an upcoming IOP event. On Monday, November 6th, we will be welcoming Cardinal Blaise Cupich for an event starting at 12 noon. You can register for that event at politics.uchicago.edu. A couple housekeeping notes before we begin today. During the second half of this event, we will open up the floor to take questions from the audience. As usual, we will take the first 3 questions from our students. Finally, please make sure right now that your cell phones are on silent. Now, here to formally introduce our speaker is Chloe Hyman. Chloe is a second year from New York City who is studying political science and history. Please join me right now in welcoming Chloe to the podium.
Good morning, everyone, and happy Halloween. It is my pleasure and privilege to introduce to you Ambassador Susan Rice. The Institute of Politics is fortunate to have such a distinguished public servant and change advocate here with us today. Originally from Washington, D.C., Ambassador Rice did her undergraduate studies at Stanford University, where she majored in history. She then received a Rhodes Scholarship and got her master's and PhD in philosophy at Oxford University. Ambassador Rice went on to do a brief stint at McKinsey before joining the administration of President Bill Clinton. In the Clinton White House, she served in several roles, including as a member of the National Security Council, as the Director for International Organizations and Peacekeeping, as well as the Senior Director for African Affairs. Following her time at the Clinton administration, Ambassador Rice became a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute, where she focused on U.S. foreign policy, weak and failing states, and the implications of global poverty. During this period, she also worked as a foreign policy advisor for multiple political campaigns, including that of the 44th President of the United States, Barack Obama. In 2009, Ambassador Rice was appointed to the position of the U.S. Permanent Representative to the UN, where she advocated for human rights and U.S. national security interests. In 2013, she left her position with the UN to become President Obama's National Security Advisor, where she worked on the Iran deal, Libya, and Ebola, among many other policy issues that face the nation. I hope that you are all at least half as excited as I am to hear Ambassador Rice speak to the present-day American situation, as well as to her career in public service. This conversation will be moderated by Alicia Sams, Director of the Fellows Program at the IOP. Please join me in welcoming Alicia and Ambassador Susan Rice.
Thank you very much, Chloe, and welcome, Susan.
Thank you.
So I'm lucky enough to have known Susan since we were young. Yeah, childhood. She had a different hairstyle. But since it's Halloween, I was talking to my cousin over the weekend about trick-or-treating with Susan when she was young. And I just wanted you to quickly tell the story and also talk about what we used to trick-or-treat for when we were little.
Right. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you all for coming. And Chloe, thanks for your introduction. Really appreciate it. Happy Halloween. I grew up in a neighborhood where Halloween was taken pretty seriously. And we would always trick-or-treat for UNICEF, which was something very important back then, and I wish would be revived. I don't know if you all do this, but there were orange boxes where we collected change and, better yet, bills that we all then pooled at school and sent off to UNICEF to help children around the world. And many years later, after the Clinton administration, I got to serve for 8 years on the board of the U.S. Fund for UNICEF, which is the U.S. fundraising arm of UNICEF, and it provides medical support, food, education, all kinds of relief to kids, particularly in conflict zones. So trick-or-treating for UNICEF was a big thing. I tried very hard to revive it with my kids and with considerable success. But it seems really to have lost traction since when we were kids. I mean, everybody trick-or-treated for UNICEF back then, and I don't think it's done nearly as much anymore.
Yeah, we all had those boxes. And so, which leads me into my next question, since public service has sort of been in your blood since you were little. Susan is the same person today, pretty much, with a little more knowledge, than she was when we were young. She's very consistent, and I think you could describe her as competitive, direct, loyal, whip smart, as my mother likes to say. She does not suffer fools. She's decisive. She's a critical thinker, and she has a great sense of humor. And whenever I talk to someone who's known her since childhood, and you say, "Did you ever think your friend would become ambassador to the UN or national security advisor?" Everybody to a T is like, "Of course. We knew this was going to happen. There's no, this was expected." So some of that's obviously the influence of having two parents that were very dedicated to public service. Some of it's probably growing up in DC, but some of it is how you're hardwired. And I just wanted to ask you, when you think about those traits, what things have served you as a diplomat and public servant, and what things have maybe put you at a disadvantage, if any?
Well, the traits of being, first of all, I have to own at least I don't know about the whip smart, but I'll take the other ones as pretty fair characterization. And as a diplomat, and I think, by the way, I should explain that I have been a diplomat in 2 incarnations. Most recently when I was ambassador to the United Nations for 4.5 years. But then prior to that, in the second part of the Clinton administration, second term, I was the Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, which meant I was the senior U.S. official responsible for our embassies, our diplomats, our personnel all over Africa. And I was 32 years old when I took that job. And I think being direct and maybe competitive and not suffering fools is a useful trait, believe it or not, in the conduct of diplomacy. I found, especially at the UN, but also as I was interacting with African leaders and counterparts, that even though people think diplomats are always supposed to be, smooth, if not obsequious, that in fact, business gets done more easily, negotiations are conducted more effectively, relationships are built and bolstered when people understand that what they hear or see from the person across the table is what they're really going to get, that there's not a lot of subterfuge or prevarication, that if you make a deal on behalf of the United States, or you say you can accept certain language in a Security Council resolution, then people know that you mean it. And if you say you can't, people know that you mean it. And so it actually, in the field of diplomacy, maybe counterintuitively, is something that I found beneficial. Now, there is a flip side to it, and there are those who have called me sharp-elbowed or abrasive, and I think that, in some cases, I'd like to think relatively few cases that might have been justified, but I think more often people were sometimes reacting to a relatively younger woman who spoke with a degree of confidence and was about the business of getting stuff done for the United States. And that was not always a warm, fuzzy process, but I always tried to be straightforward and for people to understand that I wasn't blowing smoke at them. If I said something, I meant it, and I would do my damnedest to follow through. And I think by and large, particularly as I became older and I was at the United Nations and people weren't as initially surprised by my appearance, because when I was in the Africa job, people were surprised primarily by my youth, that it was very beneficial to be able to speak and negotiate directly and encourage others to do the same.
Did you encounter the same people when you came back 8 years later at the UN who responded to you differently? Are there second chances in diplomacy?
Yeah, no, yes, because particularly when it came to some of the African counterparts that I dealt with, for better or for worse, they tend not to move off the scene very quickly. So they were, some of them still around. And actually, in fairness, when I say that as Assistant Secretary for Africa, that people sort of were surprised initially. After 3-4 years of doing the job and working through tough problems and people understanding that I was, in fact, speaking for the Secretary of State or the President of the United States, a lot of that dissipated. So it dissipated in that incarnation, too. And I think by the time, many years later, I was back at the UN, I think it was totally beneficial to have had that prior experience, both for me and for them, because the relationships had already begun to be built, and they could be just improved rather than started from scratch. It's nice.
And diplomacy is an art of relationships, and
Very
it's
much
often described as an art. So how would you compare and contrast sort of the need for subject expertise and knowledge of the world with the need for self-knowledge as a diplomat?
Well, hopefully you have knowledge of the world, particularly if you're representing the United States, because we have to play on every issue under the sun. And you are at a disadvantage if you don't have the substantive grounding. Most of national security and foreign policy is not rocket science, but it is an understanding of history and culture and economics that you have to bring to the table. But what I found I learned in a way that I couldn't through book learning or through even the day-to-day learning of the policy issues was how different countries' representatives behaved and what you could expect in a negotiation with diplomats from China or diplomats from Russia or diplomats from France. Very different things. They're different styles, different approaches. Some are direct and straightforward. Some are, always trying to play games. And so learning the way to engage effectively with representatives from different countries, and obviously you can't generalize about, every individual, but that was something that was very valuable. So the substantive knowledge is critical. Knowing your counterparts is very valuable. And I think knowing yourself is important too. I think the people who struggle, and I think it's true in all kinds of professional realms, but I think maybe particularly true in high-stakes government roles, are those that are outwardly project a high degree of self-confidence, maybe even aggression, but inwardly have real doubts. And so those doubts fuel kind of behavior that actually can be counterproductive and, in all kinds of work.
Destructive. Yeah, exactly. Coming back into the Obama administration after 8 years out, what was that like? And was it very different serving in a post-9/11 world for you?
A lot of things changed, personally and in the real world. Personally, for example, I now had 2 kids. My first child was born just as I became Assistant Secretary of State for Africa, so when I was 31, 32. My second child was born in 2002, so after I'd left government. Having, 2 youngish kids while I was in New York and they stayed in Washington was a new challenge. But substantively, I think working in a post-9/11 world was significant in that, we operated in an environment where the foremost imperative was, as it always is, but in particular in this case, to protect Americans from external attack, whether on the homeland or overseas. And what was different, that was true when I was in the Clinton administration, but what was different, even though we had the horrific bombings of our embassies in Africa and various experiences with terrorism, post 9/11, I think there was and is a presumption that something like that could happen again. And it was on such a scale with such economic and psychological and impact in terms of lives that everybody who lived through that experience, and that's all of us practically, feel a compulsion to do everything possible to prevent that. And that may color a lot of policy outside of the terrorism realm in a way that it might not have in the 1990s. The other thing, though, that had changed, and this is, I can't overstate the relevance of this. In the 1990s, there was no such thing as an iPhone. People had these big brick-sized cell phones that you could barely fit in a big bag, much less your purse. If the White House Situation Room wanted to reach me in the Clinton administration, they'd have to page me on this little thing I wore on my belt. And then I'd have to call in on a landline or one of these bricks to the Situation Room and get, whatever update they were trying to provide. By the time, we were in 2009, there were cell phones and constant use of email and news alerts and 24-hour news cycles and social media and all of these different, much more rapid forms of information flowing at us all, which made not only the job 24/7, quite literally, there was never a time when, and there really wasn't back then, but back then if the White House needed to reach you, they'd call your home phone and wake you up at night. Now with the iPhone or the BlackBerry or whatever it was, you're expected proactively to be, following everything that's happening during reasonable waking hours. And then, to have your phone on by your bedside if there's a phone call or a text or something that you have to respond to. And so the crush of information and the constant bombardment was very different. And it also made policymaking a lot more complex because you had very little time within a news cycle to respond, and you had cable, all kinds of channels going nuts, and you had social media fueling discussion and debate. So that was a dramatically different environment to come back into.
Did you ever feel like there was too much information too fast? How did you sort through the kind of constant?
Well, it's very different being a policymaker than being a regular citizen. So one of the things I've learned since January 20th is how much more even there is out there than I ever had time to consume as National Security Advisor. So when I was National Security Advisor, I got my information, first instance, from NPR in the morning as I was getting ready. I read two newspapers, the Post and the Times, every day, and I wasn't reading like the business page and the sports page. I was reading the news because that's all I had time for. And then I was consuming news alerts that, wire stories or the like that my staff or the White House Situation Room would push to us throughout the day. And of course, intelligence. We'd get a morning intelligence package that was designed for me to consume and that also included that which was provided every day to the president. So those were the principal sources, plus what my staff would bring to me as additional information that they thought warranted my knowledge or attention overnight. So now, if I'm, as a private citizen, I'm riding around, I'm still listening to NPR, I'm still reading the newspapers. I don't have, obviously, intelligence anymore. But there's this horrible thing called Twitter. And, I find myself in, moments when I'm riding in the car, as I was riding in from the airport this morning, after I've, read the news, I'm checking all through the day what's going on Twitter. It's terrible.
Yeah.
And my phone blows up with these, banners that come across, every 30 seconds. So I think it's actually worse in some ways being outside of the White House. And in the White House, the other thing is I spent many hours of my day in places where I could not be next to my phone because the phones are a security risk when you're dealing with classified information. So I'd have to lock my phone outside of my office or lock my phone outside the Situation Room or outside the Oval Office So not having physically being in possession of, whatever the heck is going on was in some ways a relief. And I knew that if there was something I needed to know, somebody would make sure that I knew.
Yeah, so it allowed you to focus. That's actually quite comforting that, that there was not the Twitter barrage.
Can't.
Is there anything that you brought from your time at the UN that was particularly important to you moving over to National Security Advisor, just in terms of having formed those relationships? You're a little more in the bubble, really, as a National Security Advisor, aren't you?
Yes, in the sense that it's an inward-facing role.
Right.
As opposed to being ambassador and representing the United States to the world, it's an outward-facing role. So as UN ambassador, I'd go and speak to the UN press corps 2 or 3 times a week. I would be meeting with foreign counterparts constantly. And as National Security Advisor, I was mainly briefing the president, working with my staff, chairing the National Security Principles Committee, which is the committee that has the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the intelligence leadership. And we would meet 3 times a week on average to talk about whatever were the tough issues that we were working through and needed to make recommendations to the president on. But I did, you still meet foreign counterparts, but on a more selective basis. You travel abroad. I traveled primarily with the president, but occasionally I did my own trips, for example, to China or the Gulf or what have you. But one of the things that I found most valuable from my time at the UN was something I already alluded to, which was I had an intimate knowledge and experience of negotiating with the Russians and the Chinese. Because when you're the U.S. ambassador, most of the tough negotiations that happen at the UN happen in the context of the permanent 5 members of the Security Council. So that's Russia, China, the U.S., UK, France. And I used to joke, but it really wasn't a joke, that I'd spent more time with the Russian ambassador than I did with my husband, because I saw the Russians and the Chinese and the French and the Brits literally all day, every day, and my husband and kids were back in Washington. So I had a very tactile feel for the way they think, what their priorities are, how they're going to approach a particular problem, which helped me a lot, particularly as at the White House, I ended up being very much involved in the management of the U.S.-China relationship, for example, which we viewed as, and I think still is, the most consequential and complicated bilateral relationship that the United States has. And so there were a lot of things. I mean, the range of issues that one deals with at the UN is very broad. And it covers literally every corner of the earth, and everything from economic development to humanitarian assistance to human rights. But it's actually not nearly as broad as what you're responsible for as National Security Advisor. And I think before I got in the role, I didn't realize quite how many additional dimensions. I mean, obviously, you've got to worry about everything to do with defense and the Department of Defense. You have to worry about everything to do with intelligence and the intelligence community. But there's also more of a law enforcement aspect to it than I realized. I mean, working with the Justice Department, working with Treasury, all of these players bring pieces to the table that I had to be engaged in as National Security Advisor, but that I wasn't responsible for at the UN.
Well, plus as National Security Advisor, I mean, you're dealing with Ebola and Zika, you're dealing with climate change and climate migration. These are all national security threats that people don't really think of, right? I mean, it's incredibly complex. So how did those two experiences, sort of given the complexity of globalization today and our national interests, how did the experience of the UN and being National Security Advisor shape your belief in what America's role in the world should be?
Well, I'm a believer in the reality that very little happens effectively or for the good on the global stage without the United States playing a very important leadership role. And I learned that through, and you gave a great example. Ebola is a great example. So 2014, in the late summer, all of a sudden, Ebola, which as you remember is this really awful hemorrhagic disease where basically you start bleeding out of your every orifice, your eyes, your nose, your mouth, and it's highly contagious if you have tactile contact. So, sweat, touch, tears, etc. And it was spreading like wildfire throughout West Africa, and it was threatening. It actually spread into Nigeria briefly, which was a nightmare, and that got contained. But Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea were just hotbeds of the epidemic. And people back here were panicking because we have direct flights and we have immigrant communities and people are moving back and forth. We had calls in Congress to shut our borders and prevent people from West Africa from traveling to the United States, which would have been both counterproductive and disastrous from all kinds of perspectives. And we, as some of you may recall, we had a case of a visitor from from West Africa, I think it was Liberia, who got very ill in Houston. Dallas.
Yeah.
Houston.
Yeah.
I think it was Houston.
Houston.
Anyway, big Texas city.
Texas, somewhere in Texas.
And that, and we didn't know how many people he had had contact with on the plane, and his family, the kids' school. Everybody was freaking out. So what do you do in that circumstance? Well, in order to protect the United States, but also, the risk to the global economy, to travel to the West African region, which was already, fairly fragile, if not unstable, the objective had to be to try to limit and contain the outbreak in West Africa and then shrink the circle of people that were affected. And I'll never forget, we had this horrifying meeting in the Situation Room where Tom Frieden, who was head of the Centers for Disease Control, presented a chart that was essentially looked like a hockey stick. The bottom was where we are right now in the epidemic, which was pretty flat. And then a huge spike up, which was where we could be in December if nothing were done. And the top of the hockey stick had hundreds of thousands of deaths. And so nobody else in the world, the UN was failing, the World Health Organization was failing, Russia and China were not engaged in this. The Europeans should have been engaged because they have lots of even closer ties than we do to the countries involved. Everybody was just paralyzed. And it fell to the United States to not just sound the alarm about how incredibly risky this was, but to rally countries of the world that had capacity to put healthcare workers in there, to surge resources, including 3,000 US military personnel for a period of time, to build health care facilities and do what needed to be done to contain and treat the disease in country. And so it was President Obama, literally, who got on the phone and was calling up, Chancellor Merkel and Prime Minister Cameron and Prime Minister Harper of Canada and the Japanese. And I was in China talking to the Chinese about what they could do. And President of the United States literally rallied the world and then went up to the United Nations during the General Assembly and insisted that we all needed to do something. And that's what happened. 10,000 healthcare workers surged into West Africa, most of them from other parts of Africa. And so Africa was very involved in supporting itself. But then the United States and Britain and France together took on the problem under our leadership in order to deal with it. So that's just one example, dealing with the crisis and the threat from ISIS. The United States put together the global coalition of now almost 75 countries to deal with the problem in Iraq and Syria. When Russia invaded Ukraine, it was the United States that led the effort with the European Union to put sanctions on Russia in order to exact a cost. And my experience is that, when we are not engaged, like now, it's a problem. And things do not get done as well or as efficiently that serve our interests. And in contrast, when we are engaged, as for example, President George H.W. Bush was when he put together the coalition to deal with the invasion of Kuwait, the first Gulf War, we are able to rally the world like nobody else.
I have one, I'll let the students follow up on sort of some of the finer points of where we are today. I have one more question, so if you want to start lining up at the microphones, we'll take student questions in a moment. And the obvious question is, how are we doing today? But I'd actually like to ask you how you think what the path is for some of our students 4 years from now, or 3 years from now, or 8 years from now, as we work to gain back perhaps some of the ground, assuming we've lost some ground, which I think you would agree with.
Well, there's kind of two different, let me answer that in two parts. What can young people do at the early stage of their career? And then, how hard will it be for the United States to bounce back? And I just want to be clear what I mean. I think the problem is that we are perceived as, and I think to a real extent we are, withdrawing. America first means, we pull out of climate change. We pull out of, or we disrupt the Iran deal. We pull out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. All of these are things that the United States led in the negotiation of and did so bringing together other partners who remain committed to the things we're walking away from. It's very important that President Trump is going at the end of this week to Asia and will visit our allies in Japan and South Korea, who have been rattled at different times by statements such as, that they should go ahead and get a nuclear capacity if they're worried about North Korea, or that we're going to pull out of the free trade agreement with South Korea. We're leaving our allies, off balance. Europe the same way at different times. And so people are questioning the staying power, the commitment of U.S. leadership. And I'm honestly very worried that by the time things change, and I believe eventually they will change, and I don't mean that I mean that we as a nation on a bipartisan basis are back to a consensus that America's active leadership role in the world is valued and serving our interests. I'm afraid that when we get back to that stage, the rest of the world may have figured out that it's easier without us.
We see China stepping in.
China's stepping in very actively. That, habits get formed that they choose not to break. And so I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that, 3, 4, 8 years from now, it'll be just like it was. I think it's going to be very hard for us to make up lost ground. So that's the one aspect of the question. I think for young people, I think it's so important to be active and engaged. You cannot sit back, and I'm not saying this is all how it goes down, and be in your little universe of your friends and your house or your dorm or your iPhone. You've got to be out there engaged in the world. You got to vote. You got to participate. You got to engage in your communities. And I hope many of you will choose public service. And by that, I don't mean only government service, although I'm very much an advocate of that, but serving one way or the other interests and people that are broader than yourself. And you can do that from the private sector. You can do it from journalism. You can do it from the NGO community. You can do it from academia. You can do it from government. But I think that's vitally important. And for those of you that may be inclined to go into government service and you're kind of wondering if this is the right time, I would say do it. We cannot have a whole gap a talent gap in government. We already have a huge problem, which is that the government workforce is old and it's retiring. We don't have sufficient regeneration at the entry ranks. And now if we have a period where people just say, well, this is not the time I want to go into government, we're literally going to have the challenges that we face compounded for years to come. So get in there, join the Foreign Service, join the civil service, join the military, join the intelligence community, join and serve and stay and learn. And, you guys are not going to be senior enough yet for it to be that big of a problem. You're in your learning stages anyway. You're getting your chops. Mm-hmm. And please don't hang back and wait, because then we're going to have a larger problem for a longer period of time.
Yeah. Well, let's take some questions. Why don't we start over here?
Firstly, thank you so much, Ambassador Rice. I'm Alex, and I'm a first year. And so I was wondering how, as you mentioned, generally when everything in the world is going well, then the United States would also be doing well. But how in the case where the United States interests aren't aligned with global interests, do you approach that? And how do you try to find a balance?
I may be old school, but I think our interests are more aligned with other countries than we perhaps recognize or appreciate. We have, our economy is highly dependent on exports, trade, foreign direct investment into the United States, our foreign direct investment elsewhere. And the notion that somehow we can just unplug from the global economy and build, trade walls or only negotiate bilateral agreements on terms that nobody in their right mind would agree to, is not in our interest. We have a real stake, whether people recognize it immediately or not, in what happens with our climate and our planet. And all you need to do is pay attention to the news over the last 3 or 4 months, with unprecedented flooding, with stronger storms, with fires that are taking out some of our most important acreage. And you'll see that while you can't draw a straight line between every crisis and climate change, that there are linkages, and that they affect us too. And if you live in Miami or New York City, sea levels rising is going to be your problem in your lifetime. And yet our response to that is to walk away from an agreement that was beginning to address the problem and needs additional iterations to continue to bend the curve, and to walk away from adjustments in our domestic economy that were aimed at creating cleaner sources of energy. That's counterproductive. I could go on and on, walking away from TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which was a high standards, pro-environment, pro-labor agreement as trade agreements go, and leaving our partners in the Pacific holding the bag, and China licking its chops because here we have seeded this important initiative and created a vacuum which they're all too eager to fill. That is not in our interest. So, we've never, since before World War II, really had a serious domestic debate about whether we should behave in an isolationist way until recently. And all of a sudden, some of those arguments are gaining currency with very little evidence that they actually advance the security or welfare of the American people. So I think that we shouldn't accept that premise.
Thank you.
My name is Joe. I'm a 1L over at the law school. When the Treasury Department hands down sanctions, specifically to your counterparts on the P5 or those close to your counterparts on the P5, how did you see those affecting your negotiations? And do you generally see those as helping your negotiations, or do you see the sanctions as something that effectively negatively hamper those negotiations?
That's a great question. We've been doing sanctions against various bad actors in the UN for a very long time. But if you take the examples of North Korea and Iran, which were some of the most difficult negotiations that we had and continue to have as it relates to sanctions, we always anticipated, and it inevitably happened, that the Russians and the Chinese would say, look, why should we negotiate a tough multilateral sanctions resolution with you when we know you're just going to come behind and hurt our companies in bilateral sanctions subsequently? And that was always, meaning they were right. It was true. And we continued to do it, and we continue to do it. But we always try, to the greatest extent possible, to do the multilateral deal first, and then sort of sweep up with bilateral measures that fill gaps that we think might have been left by whatever we were able to achieve or not achieve in the multilateral context. And it was a really, really difficult challenge back in 2010 when we were negotiating for almost 6 months a very tough sanctions regime on Iran. And Congress was chomping at the bit, Democrats and Republicans, to pass legislation that would have blown up our ability to get a multilateral sanctions regime. And they, for good substantive reasons, but also for domestic political reasons, wanted to, be sure that they got to do their thing as quickly and as publicly as possible. And we spent a lot of time, I spent time, Secretary Clinton spent time, the President, trying to get them to slow down and chill out so that we could get the multilateral resolution adopted. And then Congress came behind. So when timed properly, they can be mutually reinforcing. But then we got to be realistic because, neither the Europeans nor the Russians or the Chinese are stupid. And they know this drill, and they have and undoubtedly will ask for, in the context of a multilateral negotiation, certain protections for their entities from bilateral action.
Good afternoon, ma'am. We've seen in recent years both Russia expand its kind of military expansionist tendencies with Crimea, Georgia, the Belarus exercises. Similarly, China seems to be doing something similar with the South China Sea. I wonder what you see as the future with these two kind of peer nations as they expand militarily. How do we contain their expansion without provoking World War III and nuclear holocaust? Easy question.
That's a good question too. I think that we would be remiss to equate Russia and China. So let's take them separately. Because Russia has invaded a sovereign country and taken over its territory. Russia, that's Crimea. Russia continues to have military forces in another sovereign country, well, the same sovereign country, Ukraine. The exercises, I think, were, of a scale that was perhaps unusual, but if not unprecedented. But I don't think we should overstate their impact. China has been very active in the South China Sea, but on features that are frankly disputed. And they haven't gone over to the Philippines or Vietnam and taken a chunk of their territory, which would provoke a very stiff reaction if they were ever to do that to an American ally, a treaty ally. Just as if Russia were to mess with a NATO ally. But the way we have to deal with this is through, first of all, ensuring we preserve our own strength and readiness, that we are very clear and unambiguous in our signaling to our adversaries or competitors or whatever you want to call them, about where we are drawing the line. So Vladimir Putin, I believe, does understand that if he ever messes with a NATO country, that's a whole different ballgame. And I think the Chinese understand that if they get into an altercation with the Philippines or Australia or Japan or South Korea, that implicates the United States and our treaty commitments, and then that could risk a much more direct conflict. Where we are at risk, in my opinion, is when our own messaging is confused or muddled or contradictory. And that's part of what I'm concerned about today. I don't, when you have a president of the United States, not only as a candidate, but as president, at least at some stages, questioning our commitment to the NATO alliance, that does not help our clarity in signaling about, where the bright red line is. And similarly, when we are speaking critically about our relationships at the presidential level with our Asian allies, that's another problem. So I think these are real concerns that I think particularly Russia is, and its aggression that goes beyond the military and the territorial, and we all know about that, is deeply problematic and something that we need to very clearly push back on. And frankly, just to get up on my soapbox for a second, I think the biggest vulnerability that we have in dealing with Russia, again, China's a different story for the time being, is our own domestic internal division. Russia was able to manipulate social media so effectively because we are divided, we don't read the same things, we don't agree on the same facts, and we are atomized in our consumption of information, and we believe what we want to believe, and we want to believe that our opponents domestically are, as bad as we can imagine. Russia just took that and ran with it and exploited our domestic divisions. And they will continue to be able to do that until we as a country recognize that we have much more in common than we don't, and that we have a national security imperative to at least be unified in the face of a very significant foreign adversary. We can debate and discuss and disagree about domestic stuff, but if we can't agree that, that Russia is working against our interests, then they're going to have incredible latitude to persist beyond what government can control or what our tech companies can control. They are exploiting a weakness that we ourselves have created. Yeah. Over here.
Hi, my name is Yang. I'm the graduate student in sociology. So I read a piece by Henry Kissinger, and he predicted a possible saving grace for Donald Trump in terms of foreign policy. He said there is a gap between the public's perception of U.S. role in foreign policy and the elite's perception. So there is an opportunity for Trump to bridge the gap. However, we see that the military spending went up by $54 billion, and Trump used his tweet to taunt his Secretary of State and all these weird behaviors. So to what extent is Trump's transactional approach is effective to this building coherence? And what would be the implication for U.S. moral and political authority in the world today?
I think that a transactional approach to foreign policy and national security, particularly at the presidential level, is short-sighted and self-defeating. America's strength in the world is a function of not just our military, which is obviously the best that there is, but it's a function of our alliance systems, our values, our moral leadership. And we don't commit to defend our allies because we get a good deal out of it. We do it because we have shared values, we have shared interests, and we have made a commitment that up until now, countries have been able to be confident we would fulfill. And it's a two-way street. When we call that into question, when we try to put a dollar value or another quantifiable value on relationships that are invaluable, we demean them, and we demean ourselves, in my opinion, as the most important player on earth. And I'm also deeply concerned that we are now projecting an example and failing to advocate for democracy and human rights in many places. We are conveying to the Dutertes of the world and the Erdogans of the world, and I could go on, those who, El-Sisis of the world, that we don't really care that much anymore about whether they protect and promote human rights. We don't care whether they run their countries in a truly democratic way. And by the way, we're stomping on the press freedom here in the United States. We're attacking individual citizens, and we are behaving badly, and therefore we are giving license to others to behave badly.
I think we've got time for two more quick ones. So
Hopefully more uplifting.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll be quick. Dr. Rice, thank you for coming to Chicago, my hometown. We appreciate you coming here to share your thoughts with us. My name is Rasan Liddell, and I'm the executive director of the Afro-Sino Chamber of Commerce. Our organization is designed to build cultural and social and economic ties between the African-American community and the Chinese community. I recently returned from living in China for nearly 10 years myself. Question for you. This week, the President of the United States will be traveling to Asia to visit with Japan, China, Philippines, as you might know. Real quick, recently at the 19th Communist Party, President Xi Jinping, he declared that a new era had begun and that it was, quote unquote, time for China to replace the United States as a dominant power in the Asia Pacific, or something to that effect.
I don't think that's what he said.
That's not what he said. Okay.
I didn't hear. Did anybody else hear that?
No.
The first part, new era, yes. And China will move to center stage.
Okay.
Yes, but
Yeah.
not replace the United States in the Asia Pacific.
So my question to you is that shift to the center stage, how should we react to that? What do you think that the president will do in Asia when given those circumstances?
Well, first of all, this was not a surprise. China's been rising. China's strength and growth are, in my opinion, inevitable. It's a question of whether they rise in a responsible, peaceful way that is within the bounds of international norms and rules, or not. That's the question. And to the extent that we are upholding international norms and rules and giving them ballast and credence, and essentially inviting China to join us on those terms, that I think is an effective approach. When we have absented the stage as China is entering center stage, we have no influence or leverage. And, I think we risk getting our lunch eaten. So, our leadership role and how we exercise it is, as I said in an earlier context, in my opinion, essential across the whole spectrum of issues and challenges. And I am not one of these people who believes the conflict between the United States and China is inevitable. I do not believe that China is necessarily a great American adversary. I think it's a competitor, but it's also a country with which we've demonstrated we can cooperate when it's in our mutual interests. And managing that very complex relationship wisely and with sobriety, I think, is one of the major national security challenges that the United States faces in the 21st century. And if we approach it from the vantage point of, it is an adversary economically, from a security point of view and every other way, we're making that an inevitability, which I think is a mistake.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Natasha. Hi, I'm Natasha. I'm a first year at the Harris School of Public Policy. We've talked a lot today about the U.S.'s role as a moral authority, and whenever there is an incident, it seems like the two responses are, what is the U.S. doing about this, and also, why is the U.S. involved in everything, especially since the U.S. has made mistakes in the past, especially around military issues. So what's the balance between being a leader in moral situations, especially since you don't know who might take the place of the U.S., and at the same time not being the world's policeman or not being overbearing?
Well, that's a great question, and that's a dilemma we've faced for decades. And look, I am the first to acknowledge, and I want to be clear, that even though I'm a very strong advocate of the United States playing a leadership role in the world, I do not believe we are infallible. I do not believe we are perfect. I am very much of the view that we have made mistakes in the distant past and the recent past. But I'd sure as hell rather have us doing our best with the right intentions than the opposite. And I think what we're going to find, and I hope we can correct course quickly so that we don't find this, is that when we do not step up, nobody else is going to step up, at least in the near term. And in the long term, we may find that our competitors step up and engage in ways that are antithetical to our interests. But just to give you an example, I mean, we cannot be the world's policeman. We can't intervene everywhere where there may be a humanitarian catastrophe, which is not to say we shouldn't intervene anywhere. But we're not even talking in this country about the Rohingya crisis in Myanmar and Bangladesh. We're not talking about it. Have you heard Secretary Tillerson or President Trump say much at all about this topic? 500,000 people, victims of ethnic cleansing, being shunted off. Thank God the press is reporting it, because, we wouldn't even really know about it. But we're not engaged in a debate of any seriousness about the import of this or the implications of it, the morality of it. It's not, nobody's talking about it in Congress. It is on the UN agenda intermittently, but it's basically being ignored. And if that were the product of a deliberate decision-making process where we decided affirmatively to ignore it, I would feel better than I do now, because I don't even think we've given it the attention to come to that determination. But that is just to say that, so we're not doing much about it, but neither is India, neither is China, neither is Germany, neither is Japan, nobody is. And so when we are absent, we give license to others to absent themselves from tough problems. And that's what would have happened, going back to the Ebola example, if we had been willing to allow it to happen.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Susan. It was a real pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
And thank you all.